Hello, everybody, and welcome back to number 2 of the Enzo Explores podcast. And I'm your host, Enzo, or this guy, Lorenzo, also known as Enzo Beats. And I got my buddy on, Santi.
Yo,
How you doing, man?
doing pretty good.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you here today because you were one of the first people to reach out to me to come on this podcast. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about who you are, what you study, maybe what you do, hobbies, interests, where you want to go in life.
Yeah, well, I'm Santiago, third year psychological sciences major. And yeah, on the podcast, I imagine we'll probably talk about productivity because that's been something that I've been getting into because I was really disorganized before. And I've kind of maybe somewhat figured that out a little bit. And then let's see. I like doing deep dives into theology, kind of looking into like the study of, religion, those kinds of things. I'm a big history buff too, so seeing the way that plays into it, it also interests me a lot. And I also learn about psychology on the side, outside of my classes, because I like hearing about like some new research that happens, for example. Like seeing news reports about that kind of thing is really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you brought up was, to me, was like psychology, storytelling, and productivity, right? So I guess in that all, like, where's the best to like open up? Like, how should we start understanding that sort of those topics, or because let's see. You study psychology, right?
Yeah.
And I know I've also heard like in your own kind of like in some of the times that we've talked, you've also done like some storytelling as well.
Yeah. So
narratives.
that's something I forgot to mention. So storytelling, very interestingly, I think, plays into a lot of what I already said. So it's interesting because, and I haven't looked at this so much from like the research perspective, although I know there's some weight to it. But definitely from like a I don't know if it's an anthropological perspective, but like in a study of people perspective, I know that like narratives, the way that we like make stories, has a utilitarian purpose. So it conveys information. Like in ancient times, this would probably be like a caveman saying, "Yo, dude, last night, I was walking down past where we usually go to like fish, and then I saw this giant grizzly bear." And it attacked me, and I barely escaped my life, and that's why we should be a little cautious when we go that way. You know what I mean? So, and from what I've seen, stories told culturally, especially culturally specific stories, say a lot about what that culture values.
Okay.
Because from a story you get meaning, and especially the stories that are the most enjoyed, the most impactful to like a group of people. Those are the ones that say something about that group, right? Because that's the reason it resonates with people, is because it has something that they relate to and that they identify with. And you see that in religion too. I mean, I think a big reason why the Bible is composed of so many stories, and it's not just like lists of things that you should do, right? It's not just like a list of laws, although there is that at one point, right? It's stories of things that happened because that story format speaks to people, and while engaging, it also still reveals what a bunch of laws would say, but just in an engaging way that also captures the experience of what it's like to live in a certain culture. So you look at the Hebrew Bible, for example.
Okay.
You've got a lot of stories of overtaking evil, sort of. You have Jacob, whose name means literally, I think, to take the heel of, to overtake someone, because of the way he kind of like sneakily takes Esau's birthright, his brother. And so there's a little bit of a story there of like sort of maybe appreciating Jacob's cleverness, but not appreciating maybe what he used it for, because that ends up coming back to bite him in the story of Joseph, right? His favorite son ends up getting sold into slavery by his other brothers.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty crazy. And then they fake his death, which leaves Jacob distraught. And so it's interesting because you have in the Bible some things that, if you look at them out of context, people will be like, dang, that's like super messed up. What are they trying to teach people? Right. But if you look at a little bit broader, at some of the stories that surround that one. You get the sense of, oh, this is what happens. This is what happens when you don't do good, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is what happens when you do bad. It's not going to end well for you. And I think what people forget is that the Bible is so multifaceted, not because it's like messily constructed or like shoddily made, but because it really combines the sometimes almost paradoxical nature of living in reality and having the advice of that reality. So like in some cases, it's obviously, it's okay to do certain things, but in other cases it isn't. And I mean, you have, with the story of Jacob, like cleverness is, what's it called, is prized, but it's not in the way that Jacob used it.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jacob was, he was favored by God in a way that his brother wasn't, but, to then cheat his brother out of the birthright, that's what isn't okay. And so there's a complexity there that I think the multitude of stories of the Bible helps show, but that it's hard to see. It's hard to see if you only read like one story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think so as you bring up like the stories mentioned in the Bible, they obviously convey a very truthful message that's like core to the human experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess you can apply that to, you can look at that through like an anthropological perspective, historical perspective. You can apply that all throughout other cultures. And so, and I think you kind of already like answered the question, but like basically like, if you could say again, like why are humans so like drawn to stories? Like, I guess you're saying kind of like, it's the idea that like stories kind of like recreate the experience in our minds, or like what do you think is like going on there when a story is being told?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. At first, I was just thinking of it in terms of like it gives meaning.
Sure.
But I think even as I was talking, I realized like, oh shoot, like you just said, there is a sense of recreating the experience. It's because when you tell a story, it's vivid.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just giving meaning like 10-point plan would, but it also recreates what it would be like in that moment. You get the descriptions. Like the reason I talk about the Bible is because I recently started a plan for Lent.
Okay.
This past year to try and read one chapter of the Bible a day for these 40 days, and I've been like kind of behind now, but what I ended up getting from that was that there's a lot of detail in the stories of the patriarchs specifically. Like there's a sense before that of like an explanation of how things came to be, but then once you get to like Abraham especially, and then later Jacob and Joseph, there's so much detail in their stories, and there's a very clear sense of raw, vivid human experience. The patriarchs who always show up in paintings as like majestic flowing beards, always in like a stoic pose. It's interesting to then like to see that all your life in like Western culture, but then to actually read their stories and be like, oh, yo, he did not make a good decision. Like that was not the right move. But I think that's on purpose. I think that's to show that these people who were great for reasons that became clear by the end of their lives, in the way they stayed faithful to God. Right, that's the overarching theme of the Bible, is that struggle to kind of still believe in spite of everything going on, in spite of your own flaws. I think the flaws of a person magnify their virtue when they overcome them, right? And that's something that you can only get from a story. The sense of that, the feeling of that, the experience of that, that you wouldn't get from just being told those things. And that's why I think it's interesting that when you move to the New Testament, you see Jesus expand on what's been said before with his own interpretation, with his own teachings, but then also live it out, right? Because I'm sure he understands that it's not enough to just say what needs to be done. You have to demonstrate it. And me personally, I always respect a person 1,000% more when they live out their ideals and don't just say them. I mean, you look at anybody, like Jesus suffered crucifixion to set that example. And I think that's an aspect, even from a secular viewpoint, that I think you have to respect. I mean, if you believe that even happened. There's some people who say it doesn't, but if you do, then wow, that obviously says a lot about how far he's willing to go to live by that ideal. And I think it's something that's converted a lot of people. There's that, I think it's called the moral influence theory of atonement, which is that it's that concept of the example that Christ gave as God inspires you to do the same. And that's just one part of it, of course, from a theological perspective. There's also the salvation from sin, but that's a whole other conversation. I think that aspect alone conveys why the story is so important, and why, even though you might think, he didn't have to do all that. I feel like there's an argument made that, Jesus could have done a lot of things, but what he did end up doing was a display of his compassion as extreme as possible, to show just how willing he was to go to show his love. And I think that's why that's the capstone of the Christian Bible. That's why the event is so impactful, right, of the Passion that we're just about to head towards. I mean, it's Thursday. It's Holy Thursday. Today is the day when he gives the Last Supper, right before he gets arrested and then he gets crucified. And so we're heading towards the commemoration of that great event. Every time I think of it, it's that story that calls to me. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Bible is stories, that a lot of religious texts are told in stories and aren't just telling you what to do, because there's a humanness in that is what attracts people, what resonates,
So it seems that you bring up or pose that maybe one of the most important parts of a story is its relatability, and looking at like the story of Christ, right? Christ didn't just come down and tell you to do these things. No, he lived it out himself. And I think it sounds like you're making the proposal that that's kind of what makes his story so impactful, is that ability to demonstrate it, to live it out. It gives maybe a sense of like credibility. It gives a sense of relatability, in the sense that we too can live, can also live like that as well. So, I guess it's like that's just the most important. Would you say that's the most important part of a story, is like its relatability to the listeners, or?
Not necessarily. I think to a religious text, it's definitely very important, because any religious text will ultimately tell you to live by those ideals. The founder will live a certain way, and his followers are expected to follow suit. That's just what it means to be a disciple. But it's interesting how stories don't always have that connotation, or that goal anymore.
Sure.
Because a lot of stories now are mostly to entertain, not so much to provide a worldview or like answers to life problems. And you see a lot of fantastic stories that are really just they do look at some of the deeper, like maybe philosophical questions that we have, but they kind of leave it open for interpretation, open for you to think of, and maybe the story doesn't try to take a position. And I think that's really good too. I mean, that makes a really good story. Regardless.
Is that newer in like storytelling, would you say, or has that always kind of been a thing?
Well, I think it's always been a thing to some degree. I mean, you have Greek plays, you have dramas and tragedies that do, I think, I don't know so much about them, but I do know that they do involve the gods, and that there's like there's something to be said about how that plays into their worldview. But a big part of those plays was also to entertain. So I feel like even then you got kind of like maybe a twin importance. Maybe there's a duality back then, that now there isn't that religious element anymore, because I guess there is like maybe a change in degree. I feel like maybe in ancient times especially, there was a necessity for, if you were going to have a people, a culture, the thing that united a group of people, more so even than maybe ethnicity, is like having one God or one religion that everyone followed. I mean, you have the Jewish people, right, who had their religion, their God, regardless of if they were conquered by a different by a different group of people, they would still hold to that separate from a group of people, separate from the like their overlords. Because in ancient times, you didn't have the really well-developed political philosophy that we have today, where it's like, oh, everyone has dignity just regardless, and we have freedom of religion. That's pretty new ideas, pretty good ideas, but we had to get there from a pretty long period of human development, I guess you would say. I mean, it's a long process, but yeah, I would agree that stories at first were definitely bundled in like truth, and especially religious truth, the search for that. That nowadays there's a lot more that are just to entertain. I mean, you look at something like Arcane, and that story is not trying to tell you how to live your life, but it is trying to tell you a really interesting and really good story.
You said Arcane?
Arcane, yeah.
As in the League of Legends
The
show?
League of Legends
Okay.
show, Arcane.
Yeah, on Netflix.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just an example of a show that, like, when I watched that, I watched it with my brothers, and I was like, whoa, this show is like blowing my mind. Because it's really good for a lot of reasons that modern shows and modern stories are good. They aren't trying to tell you a message. They aren't trying to tell you how to live your life, but maybe they are trying to say something about the human experience. And I think that's something that doesn't change, even if you aren't trying to say, even if you aren't being prescriptive in your storytelling. If you aren't descriptive, it's not really going to hit with people. And on some level, even if you're telling like a really weird story that's trying to be thought-provoking, if it doesn't resonate with people, maybe it's not doing, I don't know, maybe it's not doing the full job of a story. I'm not totally sure about that yet, though.
I have a question. So, as we continue to progress in this day and age, as you mentioned that some of the stories being told now are maybe more for entertainment rather than for seeking religious truth. What kind of impacts do you think that may have on like our culture, our society, or humanity as a whole if like we were to continue to like go down the road of just purely entertainment, or like on top of that, or do you think it's inevitable that these stories of religious truth will come up again because that's just built in humanity?
Interesting. Very good question. I do think they'll come up again because, like, I think you've even seen in Hollywood, I don't know what movies were going on in like the 70s and 80s, but I do know that some of the biggest blockbusters of those times, when you watch interviews like with Sylvester Stallone or George Lucas, you hear them talking about the kinds of movies that are coming out today, being all, I don't know if it's morally neutral or morally gray, and like there isn't a clear winner and not winner, but good guy and bad guy.
Sure.
And I distinctly remember Sylvester Stallone saying, I want someone to root for in a movie, and we haven't seen that in a long time.
Yeah, that you definitely felt like that in Rocky. Have you ever seen Rocky?
I haven't seen Rocky, but I think it channels this idea that you can't explore that morally neutral gray area of like, things are unclear, the truth is kind of, open-ended, and leave it at that. I mean, I think it's really interesting when you look at like cinema, because although a lot of movies like that are really good, and it is important to like maybe test what you know, or test what you believe to make sure that it's really founded on something worth believing. But at the end of the day, you kind of pick something, even if you don't admit to that. Like the way you live your life describes what you believe, even if you don't like know what that is. I feel like you could say, oh, I don't really have an opinion on religion, for example, but that squarely would put you in the category of like an agnostic, probably, because the definition of that is, you don't really know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And that can seem like semantics, but it really isn't when you think about how drastically that changes how you live your life compared to someone who is devoutly religious or even explicitly atheist, maybe anti-theist, which is obviously, that obviously reflects the way you live. But I think like Rocky would show you and like Star Wars would show you, people still believe, as much as nowadays they're not opposed to like open-ended questions of morality and like stories that are mostly to entertain. They're not opposed to those stories that kind of take, even if it's just a vague like moral sense, they take that idea of good over evil and like protecting what's important and what's important, even if that idea is super broad, right? I mean, there's obviously a big difference between Star Wars and like the Bible in terms of what they're trying to say. Star Wars is still mainly trying to entertain, but I don't think it's a coincidence that it draws some inspiration from religion in the way that the Jedi Order is structured.
Sure.
And the way that like there is still like a dark side, even if it's kind of,
Yeah, I think
under the.
I like how you brought up like kind of those
surface.
older like 70s movies, 70s, 80s movies, because I think it definitely was a different time in storytelling. And when you watch those movies compared to the movies today, I think you are right in the sense that like the movies today are do often have like ambiguity or kind of like that moral gray zone where like you can like leave it up to the viewers to decide what's kind of going on. But I think that's why we kind of like the classics a lot though, because I feel like as humans there is a sense that we want to be told what's right as well too, or like we want to go along with the story. We don't want to have to like be left up to like make it ourselves. Sometimes we want to just be told that story. And looking at Rocky particularly, I know you said you haven't seen it, but going back to like what we were mentioning earlier with like the story of Christ, in the sense that like with Rocky it's relatable, where it's about the American dream, where he's just some guy. I think he works in a meatpacking business, and just average Joe. Anyone can be like him, but he takes it on upon himself to go through these emotions that make him a star, right, in the boxing world. And it was very reminiscent of the time as well. This was at a time where the Cold War was going on, so there was this idea of the American ideal versus like the Soviet ideal, I guess. And I think they even play into it in one movie where like his main opponent is like a Russian boxer.
I think I did hear about that.
Yeah. So it has that sort of relatable narrative at the time, and there is a lesson of you make like what you put in is what you get out. You make of life what you want it to be, and then some like truths of like this American dream is for everyone, kind of thing. That's like the message of that one. And on the other side, I think Star Wars is a brilliant movie when it comes to storytelling, because I think more so than the movies today, and of course it's not the exactly like the biblical narrative, but I think there's a lot of allusions to it in Star Wars. The hero's journey is like the biggest, what do you call it? The hero's journey is like the biggest, like, I guess, aspect of that movie. This idea that like Luke is just like a small farmer boy who makes a journey for himself, and he goes on to ultimately overthrow the Empire, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of like biblical allusions in that. You brought up like the Jedi Order, this idea of was it the Force, right? We can think of the Force as like maybe I don't know if I would say the Holy
Force
Spirit.
is kind of tricky. I don't know if it's the Holy Spirit as much as it might be, because I do know there's Buddhist influence too. So the Jedi Order is probably influenced subconsciously to some degree by like the Christian priesthood, but I think also like Buddhist monks, like the ideas are very much, I think, a fusion of sort of some Christian ideas and some Buddhist ideas.
It does feel Eastern to some extent, with the way of like, I guess like the whole idea of like you got to feel the Force, right? It's kind of
the Force is in everything.
Meditative.
I think that's one thing,
the Tao you think of maybe when you look at Eastern religion. So I could see where there's that influence as well. In the story of Star Wars, you have the idea of like the virgin birth too, though.
Yeah,
and
true.
And the chosen one is a big theme.
Yeah, I think a lot of chosen one narratives sort of get the idea from the New Testament. I think that the story of Christ, even if you don't believe in it, still impacts a lot of people to this day. And I think that's why in every story there's like a rip-off of like an earlier one. That's just the way stories are made. It's everyone stands on the shoulders of giants. And so when Lucas looks at, maybe even subconsciously, maybe he's not doing it on purpose, but I think there is a degree to where he was impacted by the Gospels, and he thought, wow, virgin birth, you know, there's like a prophecy. I mean, these are ideas that they just stir the imagination, and there's something to them where there's a sense of expectation. You await the fulfillment of, you know, a great destiny, and that always makes for a good story. I mean, when you look at the hero's journey, it's all but built in that, like, the hero has, if not a destiny, they have, you know, a challenge to make, an obstacle to, or a challenge to meet, an obstacle to overcome. And a lot of, like you've been saying, a lot of American movies have that individualistic aspect that is so very uniquely American and Western, that speaks so much to how people live, right? I mean, that's the belief here is, even if people are slowly believing less and less of it these days, the idea of the American dream is that, you know, you can just do it if you try. You can set out and make a life for yourself. And it's interesting to see how that does differ from, like, the East and a lot of other countries, which are more collectivist, and it's more about that the good of the community, and, like, maybe sacrificing a little bit of yourself for that greater health. And it's interesting to think about, because that even sounds a little bit like the gospel, and that's when you have to remember that Christianity and Judaism and a lot of Abrahamic faiths all stem from Palestine and the ancient Near East, which is literally in the East, but also very close to the West. I mean, it's like an epicenter. It's not far from, like, Europe and North Africa. It's also not far from Asia, and is obviously, like, the center of Middle East. I think because of that geographic location, the people who live there, and the milieu of the culture has a lot of that collectivist attitude that I was just talking about, where, you know, to sacrifice yourself for, like, the good of your community, or to do some sacrifices is good. But it's cool because that sets the stage for then when Christ expands on that. Because, you know, as the Messiah, he says he is the fulfillment of the old covenant. And you see that in the way that he lays down his life for everyone, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles, and for his enemies, if they only believe. And that's where you see that collectivist nature, but also that individualist nature, because the virtue of sacrifice, if it's not the sacrifice of your life, then of a sacrifice, is seen, you know, to the community and to God. But you also have that individualist component where it's like you have to choose to do that yourself. You know, I mean, very controversially, Jesus says that I have come not to make peace, but with a sword. And so it's like, he says he'll divide families. And while that's, like, some disturbing language, it's meant to not mince words at that idea that if you go down this path, if you choose to follow Jesus, especially at that time, you'll be going against what everyone else will be believing, right? Because the Jews were a minority. Obviously, the new religion of Christianity was going to be a super tiny minority. And so it's a hard life. It's a hard life. And I think that's an aspect that stories pick up on as well. You know, that aspect of sacrifice is very essential to a lot of stories. Because if you want to do something out of the norm that would make for a good story, for a meaningful story that impresses on you something that's not seen in everyday life, there's got to be a sense of sacrifice that the hero or the main character has kind of earned something.
You were saying about the idea of the story of sacrifice, how you know, individualistic culture in the West, collective culture in the East, and this sort of narrative that kind of pulls in the center in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity is an interesting mix of collectivist ideas and individualist ideas. I think maybe this is an idea. I'm not sure if this is, like, the case, but I suspect that in ancient history, collectivism, like, reigned supreme because humanity was not in like a particularly well-off position on like a broad sense in the way that we are today, even if there's a lot of suffering still. I'm not saying that there isn't, but there's like 6 billion of us, 7 billion of us today.
8 billion now.
8 billion of us now?
8 billion now.
That's crazy. We're up there. But back then there was not that many humans, and
like
life was not
150 million.
150 million, and life was not particularly easy either. So, like, collectivist culture, I think, was in maybe evolutionarily adapted way for people to come together and like ensure their survival together. I think part of the reason individualism came to the scene is specifically because of what Jesus taught, and I think that's why you see it in Western cultures, coupled with what I touched on earlier, like more developed political philosophy, to put it simply, that allows people to have dissent, but for the country to not, be destroyed by that. Because, if you were to speak out against your elders or whatever in like an ancient community, I think there wouldn't have been probably a mechanism to do that if you were to like try some of the same stuff you would do today, like a protest. Like, I don't think that would really fly well. I think there's probably a different way to do it, but you couldn't do the exact same thing because you would probably threaten the survival of the community or something, if that makes sense. Like, there's some things that are only possible today because of how far we've gone in terms of allowing those freedoms and rights to people, which to some degree is only possible because of the technological progress that we have, right? Because, if you have to like be working 24/7 just to provide meals for your family, you can't be worrying too much about your mental health, which is something that we are not lucky to worry about, but at least it's good that we only have that to worry about and not so much material things. Like, there are a lot of things not good about America, but at the very least, at least we in this room, I imagine, are materially well off, and that leaves us able to help others, think a little broader about other things that are affecting ourselves and our society and other people. And I have no idea what that had to relate with what we were originally talking about. We went off on like a tangent, but
I think in some sense that it kind of calls back to the idea that these stories are very important to call back to and to live out in our own lives, because we could live our lives, we could live our lives without story. We could live our lives simply just going through the motions. Like you said, America's pretty well off. We're just kind of going through the motions. But when we call back to stories, and we call back to this remembrance that, stories tell about something maybe greater than ourselves, about values that are important. And when we remember that in our lives, maybe we could do a little good for others.
Yeah.
Emulate those stories.
Yeah. Well said. I think that's a pretty good summary of what I said and tying it back. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, still maybe tying up a little bit of like storytelling, but on a big, I don't know, maybe anthropological perspective, but I don't know if you've heard the saying, was it story becomes legend, legend becomes myth, or also like history becomes legend. I think that's what it is. History becomes legend, legend becomes myth. And I wanted to ask if that makes sense, your opinion on that sort of phrase, this idea that all these myths that we have, the myths of the Greek gods, the myths of the flood myth, right? The creation myth, all these different stories that feel kind of so tied to human nature, to human experience. What do you think happened there? Like in a historical perspective, right? Like, why do we have these stories? What happened to humanity throughout its years of trying to exist on this planet?
Yeah. That's a really good question. It is something I've thought about, especially because, I started with Genesis for my Bible chapter a day. And so actually, that was something I was thinking about when I was mentioning the patriarchs like Abraham, is that there is a lot less detail in the earlier 11 chapters that came before that, which is largely, creation stories, how humanity came to be before they focused on, Abraham's family specifically. And I think it's fascinating because I've read that the academic scholarly kind of consensus is that early Genesis is historicized myth, and that later Genesis and like Exodus, I think, is like a mythologized history or something like that. And I thought it was interesting to see that.
That's an interesting way to put it.
There's like a continuum in the scholarly field that like the further back you go, the more like unreal the events are. And I thought that was interesting because I feel like when I read it and when I hear about like Greek gods as well, like other like creation stories, it's fascinating, the concept that you were saying too, where like history becomes, what was it? History
becomes legend. Legend becomes myth.
Legend becomes myth. I think that is so true, because I think when you're looking at a lot of these like ancient religions that are talking about like these crazy events, what you see as anthropological studies kind of delve into them is that a lot of them, especially like ancient Sumerian, I can't say about a lot of other places, but like a lot of the same stuff is speculated. In ancient Sumeria, a lot of the early gods, like if you take Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, literally the first story, the earliest recorded story that we have, it was literally based on a Sumerian king who scholars believe did exist. There's archaeological evidence to support his existence, but who was later deified. And so I think that speaks to the fact that like there, in the early memory of human history, there are some great figures who had to have done pretty amazing things to get the first civilizations off the road. I mean, Gilgamesh is credited to building, I think it's like dams and canals or something like that, and like organizing like the agriculture of ancient Sumer, and obviously doing a lot of projects to make sure that like humanity would flourish and prosper. And those are huge things. And I think over time what happened is people would talk about the guy like he was a giant, like he was a god because of his impact, and then that slowly over the years turned into myth, turned into legend, as a result of like the constant retelling and like aggrandizing of what he did. I think you see that in a lot of like ancient mythology. I think there is a root to most, if not almost all of it. There's like a root person who really did something that was then deified later, and made larger than life, because in life they already were so large and so impressive.
I think it's those people early in our human history that went through some journey or went through maybe some tragedy, a mistake, or some big lesson that was so paramount to that civilization's survival that they couldn't forget that lesson, or else they would go extinct. They needed to memorize, or they needed to remember that that lesson that maybe that person had experienced. And so you look at it practically, right? So I don't know, I guess like bring up maybe bring up like a flood myth story or something. That, okay, this flood happens. Practically, you need to tell your kid about this story. This could happen to you. That kid tells his kids, this is what happened. This is the lessons we've learned. Let me pass this on and on and on and on. And then it becomes more of an old legend, I guess, a folk tale. But there's a very real lesson that needs to be learned. Or else if we forget,
or also
we
repeat
go
your
away.
mistakes, right? History repeats itself.
Right.
It's that idea. And I think going back to that point about the mythologized history, I think the reason I believe in Genesis and why I believe in the Christian faith, in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, is because unlike a lot of other past religions, unlike the ancient mythologies, the Christian Bible has stories of normal people, ordinary people, like who nonetheless did like a miracle here and there when it came to like prophets, but like these aren't gods. Abraham isn't like a huge god like Krishna or like the gods of pantheons across the world. He's just a dude from like the outset, and so is Noah, so is Adam, so is every single human figure who's spoken about. I think no matter how no matter how impressive they are, and no matter how long their lifespan is, you can get into a whole conversation about how that might be allegorical. They might not even have like supremely long lifespans or like centuries long. But no matter how impressive that's made to paint them, they are still human people, and that's what makes me suspect that it's not just like there's not just like a semblance of a real event, but that that was like a real event. Like it's hard to believe that it didn't happen when you have such a raw and sort of honest look at what looks to be what happened with these people in the past. Like the Greek mythology, there's clearly attempts to like try to explain natural phenomena through, saying, lightning, Zeus is hurling his lightning bolts literally into the ground.
The sun being carried across in a chariot, right?
Right, and then you have Prometheus holding the world up. And so it's like they're making attempts to explain the world around them through story, and it's memorable, and that's part of why it sticks in the cultural consciousness. But I think the reason I'm so impressed with the Bible is just that those stories don't seem like they were made just to explain. It seems like they were recorded and it seems like they were just remembered as they were, and that later people are now, and even then too, trying to understand, if that's what happened, I realize that says something about reality. I think there's that emergent religious truth that comes from the stories of Genesis and of the Bible, where in a lot of other religions it's more prescriptive, it's more the point, and it is the point in the Bible too. I mean, it's also religion, but I think it's also true. Ultimately, I think it also is just trying to say that, like, hey, these are things that happen. Abraham was a person who lived, and while the archaeological evidence isn't fantastic past, I think even like Moses and before Moses, it gets pretty spotty. Part of that is just because that was like 3,000 years ago, and even evidence from Jesus' time is pretty spotty, although there's good evidence to know that Jesus existed because there's like independent sources for that. You get much farther than that, and it just becomes difficult because you get far back in time. And I think that's where like ultimately faith plays into it. I mean, as much archaeology as like will come out that's like, that might contest what happens in the Bible or might support what happens in the Bible. Like I was saying earlier, at the end of the day, you could go back and forth on these issues. I know I have, when I really looked into this and started giving, because I'm a cradle Catholic, when I started giving it a closer look and like really trying to see if this is something I should really believe and really invest my time in, I was going back and forth. But I think now I've reached a point where it's like you either take the leap of faith or not, right? And the thing about faith is that it's not like being sure all the time on solid ground. Now, if you look at Peter, who's like the leader of the church, the first pope, he's a perfect example of, dude, you're gonna make mistakes. It's gonna be hard. You might even deny Jesus. You might even deny you're a Christian. That's basically what that would mean today. But if you do what he did later, and that's a theme that goes through the entire Bible, is that you'll mess up. The patriarchs messed up. Adam even messed up in the garden. But what you forget about is that Adam later made it up to God. He apologized. He repented. And he's canonically considered to be in Abraham's bosom in Judaism, which is like the Jewish equivalent of like heaven, what we believe in the Christian Bible. And what we believe that Adam and Eve are canonized, that they're saints, actually. You don't really think about that as Old Testament figures as being saints. But that is what we believe for him and for Eve and for the prophets. And that goes to show that, these people, like, they struggle too. They seem like gods and portraits. And that maybe is the way that some people see them. But that's not really the point. Although they are impressive, like Gilgamesh, they're not to be deified. They're to be related to, like we were talking about earlier. And they're for you to aspire to be like. And I think that's something I like about it, that I don't see in any other religion, and that I think the Hebrew Bible in its writing was taking aim at. Here you have a religion where the God in Genesis 1 is all loving, all merciful. He creates the world and he blesses it continuously. You'll see that if you read it. And you don't see that in other religions, in the ancient mythologies. That's not kind of the point, It's like the gods are vengeful and like hating, but you see, and that's why I believe it, you see real love, and you see people who are really trying, and that the goal is, like I was saying with Peter, is to come back, to repent. And that's what I see. That's what I see in life. I feel like that's true to life, because when you're in your relationships with other people and you mess up, I mean, the thing you have to do is you have to come back. I think it's the same with God. I think that's fundamental to what it means to be human, is to make mistakes. I mean, in the hero's journey, classic example of a story format where the hero goes through tests and trials, they fall, they have a lowest point, and then they come back up. They get back on their feet, like Rocky. I haven't seen the movie, but I guarantee that there's a point when he gets punched in the face, and then he's almost out, and they're like, "Is he gonna stay down?" Yeah. And then he gets up, and then he wins.
Even more so, I think there's a part in the story where it looks like the whole thing's over before the fight even begins. But then, you kind of go through the motions of realizing, like, no, I just got to keep going, and
yeah. I love stories like that. I don't just think it's what's it called? I don't just think it's like a wishful thinking. I think it's true. I think it's really the way that it just is just true to life. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah.
I'm gonna make a claim, and I'm willing to be wrong about this claim. But I think just kind of looking at lightly, like, I think maybe the reason why we're still, and I believe that we'll continually be pondering and wrestling with these stories in the Bible, and why they're going to continue to resonate with humanity as we go on, compared to other mythologies. Is like you look at like the Greek gods and maybe other pantheons, and a lot of the times they're used to just sort of explain natural phenomenon that was going on. Why the sun, why the sun is where it is, why the Earth is where it is, why the sun is, moving in the sky. These sort of natural phenomenons that sort of go on. That ultimately later on are just kind of explained with science, right? So we don't need that core of the story anymore, but we still do talk about some of these Greek myths, because there is still like some truth that goes on. There's lessons of greed, there's lessons of persistence, there's lessons of telling the truth. So they still do come up. But some of it it's not as valued as it was back then, because some of its goal was to just explain natural phenomenon. But now we have science that can explain some of that, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting because of the way that like bad arguments for religion in the past have made scientists today, not all. I mean, there's still a lot of like religious scientists, but there's some that like wave the banner of like religious skepticism and see it as like, well, God sort of exists just to like only exist now to fill in the gaps where science isn't right now. But if you look at what religions kind of perceive as God's role in the world, it's not really ever been that God's just there to like explain natural phenomena, because like that explanation is given, like even in Genesis 1. They do explain that God created the entire world, right?
But I think in that scenario, science still needs one miracle, right?
Yeah. But going back to like, because you might think when you see like when you say that like science is there to explain how things happen, you get into a little bit of an area of, I would say, overlap, where a scientist might say contradiction, right? So there's that idea of like, an atheist or a skepticist would be like, oh, science explains something this specific way, like maybe how the brain works, and they go, but I thought that was just like, that was just God's doing, or like when it comes to weather, it's like, I thought that was God's doing. God was angry, so there was thunder, because you do get that kind of like moments like that in the Bible, even if it's not, literally hurling a thunderbolt.
All right, and we're back. A little bit of technical issue, camera overheated, but one thing that we were talking about was the myths of the old and the story of the Bible and why it's still resonating today. And I was just kind of like wrapping up the idea of like, science kind of explains away some of the older myths of the Greek gods. But I think one of the things that keeps the Abrahamic story so persistent is that obviously, one, it's not trying to explain natural phenomenons.
Yeah, it's
but,
not really a focus. Yeah.
But it's explaining human phenomenon, human condition, and I don't think that's anything we'll ever escape, as long as we're humans, right?
Yeah, I think that definitely is what leads more credibility to it and to like the organized religions in general that like exist today. I mean, they're trying to explain the best way to live and not like, taking a stab at why things are the way they are and like in a way that like empiricism and like scientific methodology obviously is much better at. I mean, I think it's a credence to Christianity and these modern religions that they aren't really going for that, even though there's some people who will try to go that way, and I like will generally advise a no on that because you might end up in a rabbit hole of like denying reality. And the thing about like science and too is that people don't realize is that a lot of it was a lot of the foundations that science sort of builds on was made by religions, especially Catholicism. I mean, if you look at the Middle Ages, the scientific method is basically derived from Greek philosophy to a certain extent, right? Aristotle, who did a lot of his like metaphysical work, but also scholasticism. So the school of scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas, of kind of asking questions about how it is that God made the world. It's interesting to see that science in the West was largely born from that perspective.
Yeah.
Understanding the world that God has made outside of the Bible in that empirical way. And so it always interests me when someone tries to say that like, oh, this disproves the Bible. Because it's like, the Bible's probably not trying to say what you think it's trying to say.
It's not trying to make that claim.
And it was Christians who first got the ball rolling in the West with this. I know there's contributions from like Islam with like the Arabic numerals and stuff.
The Islamic world did a lot for
Yeah,
science as well. Yeah. In
So,
other parts of the world.
I think that's a testament. Yeah, I think that makes it a testament to religion in general for like helping start all that up. I mean,
well, if I can make a point, I remember hearing Jordan Peterson make this point. I believe it was him. It actually might have been someone else on the gospel series that he has. But the point was being made that if you want to study something, like empirically, you can't worship it. And so let me put it this way, where the reason why the Greeks didn't come up with a scientific method and ancient cultures didn't study the world as empirically and as scientifically as we do today is because they're still too busy worshiping the natural world.
Yeah, I think there's something to that.
They applied like a mythological element to these things that they worshipped, and so you can't study it. You couldn't study it empirically.
You can study empirically. Yeah, and I think like, because a viewer might think, oh, what about Aristotle, who was literally Greek, but the Greek philosophers largely were outside of like the majority realm of most people who were thinking in terms of like Greek gods and stuff. Most of them were like, I don't think those are good explanations of the world. I'm gonna come up with a different one. And so, and especially because Greece was in a place, in a relatively comfortable place. Well, I mean the majority Greek population, because there were slaves and stuff, but like the average Greek citizen was in a relatively comfortable place because of those slaves and because of peace, the relative peace of the time that gave them the room to explore a lot of these philosophical questions and kind of think, hey, wait a minute, I don't like these myths. They don't seem like very good explanations. They seem kind of crappy. And it's because of that, like you said, they worked outside of that framework of worshiping these natural conditions and instead tried to explain them. And that's why you get a lot of fantastic analysis from Aristotle and the other Greeks. Not all of them are fantastic. Maybe most of them are not true, but they are very good at analyzing the world.
I think it was a good step in reason and logic, but I think there were still some limitations where a lot of the times Greek reasoning thought like, well, logically it's right, so it must be right. But sometimes the most logical answer isn't the correct answer.
Yeah, and usually that's because of like a fault in the logic, because if logic isn't logicking, then you probably have to fix something somewhere.
Let's see. I was going to bring up a point. What was it? I don't know what I was going to bring up. I was going to bring something up about science and Christianity, the modern day. I'm not really sure what it was.
Was it about like modern perceptions?
Maybe. I think one thing I could just kind of throw out there is like the Big Bang Theory, was proposed by a Catholic priest.
Yeah, it's
in
interesting. Yeah.
Bulgaria. I want to say Bulgaria or Hungary. I forget which one.
It might have been Romania.
Was it Romania?
I don't know though.
Could also be Romania.
Eastern.
Yeah.
Let's say Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Eastern Europe. Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Genetics by Mendel, another Catholic friar.
Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel. I never know the pronunciation of these people.
But there's a lot of great minds in scientific thinking and what we've got today. And I don't think this whole idea of like religion and science, I don't think it's something contradictory. I think it's something that actually works in harmony with each other. And I don't think they're trying to explain the same questions, right? People think that they're competing for truth, but they're not. See, because science explains okay, what is going on? I think what is everything, and then religion kind of explains a little more of like why.
I think that's a pretty good way of putting it.
Yeah, and science explains some whys as well. And
technically, I would argue no.
Sure.
Let me see how to word this. Yeah, technically no, because the interesting thing about science in general is that there's some why, but that's a little misleading because specifically the why.
It depends on an ultimate why, though.
Yeah, and specifically it's the interpretation of data that is the why. Because the thing about science is that it's like the most conservative. The whole methodology is based on drawing the most conservative conclusion of what you can be reasonably sure is the truth based on what you have in terms of data right now, based on what you've tested. And so the reason it's so robust is because it takes a very systemic process to narrow down the possibility of what made one thing happen, in the world. And that's my, layman's terms explanation. I don't exactly know the best explanation for it, but that's the basic idea. But there's no real why. Like, it's interesting because even in like evolution, you would imagine to see like something of a why, like, oh, if we evolved to be in a certain way, then maybe that should explain, why or what we ought to do, which is another question that religions try to
That's definitely different questions. I mean, in evolution, there's explanations of why kind of things are happening, like through natural selection, and things are like logically, like, okay, I could see like, why we humans lost our tails, right? We don't need tails, but I think the question of why is a little bit different of like what we ought to do and whatnot. And then that's
exactly,
where religion comes in.
There's some concept of like, like you could even explain religion in terms of evolution, in terms of like a lot of organized religions today try to draw adherents from outside of the culture that it was born in. And so you could sort of apply the concept of, well, it's got that potential to grow, and as a result, it outcompetes in a similar way that like a species with a greater adaptation might outcompete another. But it falls short of that because that's just one part of the religion and of like the religious creed. And like just because you can sort of explain that aspect of it doesn't mean that like that's all that's happening. You know what I mean? And like science in general is all about like we made a conclusion, we know a thing is happening because of something else, but it doesn't tell you what to think about that. Like a thing is happening, and a lot of times people will be like, oh, so that must mean this moral concept, or we ought to do this because of that. But the thing you need to remember is that it's just saying something's happening. And if you're saying something ought to be a certain way because of that, that's probably you just like importing your own biases into it. I think this was something in Western philosophy, like Renaissance period. I think it was David Hume who said this was like the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is doesn't mean it ought. And that's a whole like epistemic question like you go into. But yeah, that's the piece of why science doesn't really doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what's going on. Yeah.
This kind of plays into like the story of going on in society today. There's a lot of tension. At least people think between science and religion. I don't think there is a tension. I think it's harmonious.
Yeah.
But before I kind of explain my thought on what's going on, I want to ask you, in the realm of all the stories that exist that resonate with us today, which story is our society in right now?
Which story is our society in? That's a very, very good question. I've actually looked at some videos on like I don't remember what it was called. It had to do with like medieval like romanticism, not romanticism, but like sort of medieval like chivalry, not just the concept of like holding the door for the lady, but like the whole concept of like duty and like going out to like protect your people and like the religious aspect of it. And it was interesting because some of that has survived to the modern day. Some of that Middle Ages concept of like honor and duty and upholding that in like a knightly, noble, virtuousness. Some of that still exists. And like if you take like a Marvel superhero, this is like one of the most interesting videos I've ever seen. Like if you take a look at a Marvel superhero, there's an aspect of that in them. You know, they're virtuous people, and like that having almost doing your best to like perfect your inner self, your moral side is, what's important. That's what saves you, obviously religiously, and that's what always, as a result, that's what makes people prevail. You look at St. George and the dragon. That's literally where that story of St. George slaying a dragon and then marrying a princess. That's literally where the idea of like knight killing dragon saves princess is from. It's literally that story, and the idea is literally that St. George's faith in the Lord is what allows him to slay the dragon. He couldn't do it on his own. That's the thought process of the Middle Ages and of Christianity in general. And so that's sort of imported, but in a different way. I mean, it's interesting because you look at a Marvel superhero and they don't necessarily believe in religion. Religion isn't really what fuels them. It's a sense of virtue, but it's stripped of that meaning. But also imported is a sense of, very interesting sense of like might, a sense of like their power helps them get there. And that's an idea that you could say is even older and stems from the Greco-Roman myths and the Greco-Roman cultural priorities. So what they valued that was different from the Middle Ages that came later is like just being really strong, being powerful, and you see that in like for a different reason in like Marxist philosophy today. Like it's about power, but in those days it was revered in gods and in the heroes of the Greco-Roman stories. And that aspect still survives in Marvel superheroes because you want to see them, beat people up. You want to see them overpower others because like they're stronger on top of being virtuous. And so it's interesting because you get like both of those at once in the current culture. And what exists today is I would say a pretty interesting combination of both of those insofar as like the good and evil that we've been talking about goes. And then in terms of like the morally neutral, morally gray stuff where it's like open-ended, that more delves into the this is a totally different topic that you can go into, but like the Renaissance period of like religious skepticism and wondering what is truth, not being sure about religion and religious dogma. You see that in American culture today as well. I mean, you see that especially in debates about like, or just general disagreements about the nature of America as a country. What is it founded on? There's tons of arguments, but I'd argue historically that it's founded on, and you could hear it argued, America was founded on Christianity. You could hear it argued, America isn't founded on Christianity because what about Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Jeffersonian Bible and stripped the religiousness from the Bible? If you do look at the actual founding fathers, Jefferson's kind of a straw man, but I wouldn't go so far, actually, as to say that it's founded on Christianity and just leave it at that, because that seems a little misleading, because you have to remember that this is also post-Renaissance. This is post-Reformation. You're living in a not entirely Catholic Europe and a not entirely Orthodox Christian Europe either. I mean, post-Reformation, especially in America, the first Americans are radical Christians, the Pilgrims, the Quakers, the Methodists. All of those groups of Protestants are the more radical stream that was different from the kind of Protestantism that Luther championed. And so where that goes back to like the Marvel superhero is their ideals, what inspired them to form America is the example of Christ. And so you see a little bit more of an emphasis on that. There still is, like I said earlier, the Founding Fathers do believe in like the tenets of Christianity, except for Jefferson. Maybe Jefferson's not. But they emphasize more, and you see that in a lot of modern Protestantism today, they emphasize more the example of Jesus, which I talked about a little bit before. But like for me, there's a little bit more of like a half and half, like double importance. I wouldn't say half and half. Double importance of the example of Christ and like the religious tenets. I feel like you need both. But for them, it was a lot more of an emphasis on the example. And so where that comes back into the Marvel superheroes thing is what you see in this culture is a moving away from that. And that's what's interesting. That's what's really happening, I think, in society today is there was always a reverence originally for the Christian story. And there was a lot of respect, but that respect is what's not so present anymore in modern society. Mm-hmm. You see a lot more satires of Christianity. People don't really like care about it so much. And part of the reason I think people today have thought that America was founded on Christianity full stop is because there were a couple great awakenings that happened like historically throughout America's history that did make it more Christian than it was originally. And I thought that's really fascinating. You could even argue that for most of America's history, it's been pretty strongly Christian. And I think I would agree, especially past like the 19th century going into the 20th century. You had after the Civil War. Lincoln gets more religious after being kind of like the founders, and that he's just more impressed by like the effect of Christianity. Like, he would quote the Bible, but he would be kind of like, he would shy away from the question of if he's like a believer. But then as the war progressed, he started to say that God's hand was causing the events to happen. And he started believing a lot more, which I thought was really interesting. So I think what America is ultimately right now is it's at a stage, I don't know how that would fit into the Marvel superheroes, if I'm being completely honest, but
I think I know.
How would you say?
I think I know a little bit. So I think, at least this is what I'm sort of perceiving that's going on in our media and our culture, is it kind of calls back to what we're warning about earlier. I mean, we're not warning about it. The people who gave us these stories are warning about it, that if you forget these stories, you're going to make the same mistakes. Yeah. And you're going to repeat those mistakes. And I think that's where society is right now.
Yeah.
I don't know I think we're starting to repeat some mistakes. Yeah. But I think alternatively, there's a pushback to these sort of traditional stories. Yeah. That, like, we can't forget the stories because they are so woven into the human nature, into the human experience. We've already made these mistakes before. We don't have to make the mistakes again if we hold on to these stories. And I think you're seeing that in society today. The reason I had asked you earlier, like, what story do you think society is going through right now, is because I've heard this, and this isn't my idea. I think this is, again, back to Jordan Peterson's idea. But his idea that, like, society is wrestling with, like, the story of the Tower of Babel. And you had just read that recently in Genesis chapter 11, I want to say it is.
I look, you had to speed read through it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the last. Funny enough, it's the last story that you were talking about.
Before Abraham, chapter 11. I think
yeah,
it is.
I think it's the last story where. What was that thing you're saying? Mythological history?
Oh yeah, it was like historicized myth was supposedly like, I think all of Genesis, and then like Exodus onwards, or like Exodus, the next 4 books of the Pentateuch was like the opposite. Yeah, but yeah, yeah.
And so this idea that society right now kind of forgot some of its stories, and we're going through the Tower of Babel right now, where we've shunned away these stories, we've shunned away the truths and the values that they have given us, especially the Judeo-Christian story, right? And we're saying, okay, we don't need God. This is the Tower of Babel, where we don't need God, and in fact, actually. We can define our own truth, right?
Yeah, that's like, what's it called? That really started with like the Renaissance and with liberalism, because the thing that started what Western culture's trajectory is now is, once Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church, when the Catholic Church had was religiously uniting kind of Europe, when Martin Luther made it clear that there's a really complex social political reasons for why it ended up happening, but Martin Luther ultimately he breaks from the Catholic Church He becomes more and more disillusioned, and then as a result, a bunch of other people are like inspired with him. And what ends up happening is not what Luther envisions. Some of the Catholic Church would prefer to happen, but something else entirely, right? You get what you were just talking about, which is like liberalism. First there's like a century of like religious wars in Europe, which is like regrettable and very sad. But then after that, there's the sense of, well, we need to just let people have the freedom of like to believe what they want to believe. And then with the Renaissance, that's when you get people like David Hume, who said the is-ought fallacy. I described it as, you know, a reason to think that like you can't find meaning in science, but I'm pretty sure he actually used it against religion, and he was saying that like you can't say that. I think he was, I don't remember exactly how he was using it, but he was one of the religious skeptics he kind of formed the way for original liberalism, that was the idea of man, you know, people being the center of government and like human society, and that is a radical change. That seems like maybe a knee-jerk reaction would be to say, well, yeah, I mean, obviously society is of people, so it's going to be for people. But that's actually a pretty radical change, especially like a religious person needs to think about that, because that's a change from what? From the center being God. And that's, and like in my personal opinion, that's a sad change, I think, for society at large to decide. I feel like I've looked into it, and I know the Catholic Church didn't make a lot of fantastic decisions while it had like quote unquote power as like the like number one religion of Europe. But there was a lot of good that it did in kind of having Europe united. And now that it's after it split, I mean, obviously there was a bunch of wars, but now there's also an uncertainty. The beginning of that process that you were talking about with liberalism is a moving away from God. And that's what I think is unfortunate. I think there's some good that came out of it. I mean, people could express the freedom of conscience. They could believe what they wanted to believe, which is fine in and of itself. But what I actually don't like, this might be a hot take, but what I don't like about like the First Amendment and freedom of religion is freedom to practice just about anything you'd want. Because I think that let the door in for, not for other religions and like practicing other religions. I'm fine with that. But with religions that are like low-key cults, like if you look at Scientology and like a lot of like, I think it's NXVM, you know, there's a lot of like low-key cults that like pose as religions, but and they're only able to do so because the First Amendment is so broad. And like I love that it's broad, but I think it's too broad. And I think the one good thing that having like a like institutionally religious society is that it allows you to just like full stop crank down on that nonsense. Like and that would happen. Like there would be people who are trying to like incite violence and like usurp the people with like a different, you know, complete religious concept that, you know, sometimes is very, very like morally.
Well, let me comment on all of that. There's a whole lot that went there. So I'll kind of break that down like one at a time. So one of the claims that you're making is that like the sort of pull of liberalism kind of first originally started with the Reformation, and I think the Reformation itself, I think there was some good that came out of it in how the church as an institution responded. You know, there obviously needed to be some change in the church as an institution. Yeah, you see that in like
Council of Trent too.
Right. So I think the Reformation in some sense was necessary for the Catholic Church as an institution to fix its problems. Yeah. And of course, there's still problems, you know, in the institution because it's run by humans. You know, nothing's perfect. And I think kind of like you were saying. So the Protestantism comes about. The focus does. I feel like with Protestantism, their focus is actually to put more focus on God. But I think, what happens is it's a more personal relationship with God, and sometimes without the accountability of the institution, that personal relationship can be a little more subjective.
Let me modify that. I do think that the personal nature or the personalized nature of your relationship with God, I think that's one thing that Protestants really get right.
Sorry.
Oh,
you can keep going.
Yeah. I think that's something Protestants get right, and I think that's something that like a lot of Catholics could take notes on. Like I think that's something good. I don't think that's something that like they're doing wrong. I think the issue, and I agree with you that they still have a big emphasis on religion. I just think that Protestantism contesting the authority of the church opened the door for liberalism, which is seen in the religious skeptics that came in the Renaissance that was after the Protestant Reformation. And I think that, the only reason that ended up being possible is because of the Protestant Reformation. So yeah. So I actually agree with you entirely. That's what I meant to say, is that Protestantism kept that importance of God. Like if you read Martin Luther, his idea of like what a church should look like is still as an institution that sort of has importance over society and over family life and all those things. But it's the radical reformers who were so different from Luther and a lot of the like mainline Protestant branches that stayed in Europe. Like the reason they went to America in the first place is because Luther and them didn't like them, and the Catholic Church was obviously not a fan of just how far they were. So they felt like they were in exile. They weren't welcome anywhere, and so they went to America instead to look for somewhere they could build their society. And you really need to think about that when you look at America today and the kind of quasi-religiousness of America. It's like kind of there and kind of not, and kind of not really institutionalized. There's a very specific historical reason for that. I think it's interesting to see that's because the Radical Reformation basically has America as its like home, kind of, in a way. And I don't think that's something that people really think about. And so people get confused when they hear, especially about like Puritanism and like really extreme like moral prescriptions. They think, that must be Catholic, or that must be, Christianity in general. But it's like a lot of that comes specifically from the radical Protestantism. I mean, some of it might be Catholic. You'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But there's something you need to think about, is that's kind of, that alongside liberalism and alongside new ideas post-Renaissance are what make up a good portion of like the American story, you could say. I don't have a great example of like how like Protestant America feeds into like stories, because I just don't have an example of that off the top of my head. But I think there's a good example is Star Wars, because Luke Skywalker, there's a hint of that in how Luke Skywalker rebels not just against this evil empire, but also against the Jedi Order, which could be seen as like subconsciously. I know this is probably not intentional whatsoever, but it could be seen as like the religious institution. It could be seen as him like breaking through that and finding a truth inherent to reality right through the Force that's a little bit outside the bounds of what's described for him. That's a very Protestant idea.
There's a little bit of a Protestant undertone, I guess, in the sense, maybe in the sense of like the idea of the individualist comes out a little more, where his journey with the Force isn't through the Jedi Order, which, by the way, at the time there isn't much of a Jedi Order, right?
True.
By Luke's point. But his journey with the Force is more personal, right? And you kind of see his journey, kind of playing with a little bit of playing with the dark side. You kind of see that in in episode 6 when he comes out in a black robe. It's reminiscent of, it's not going through the institution of what the Jedis are, but that personal journey with the Force, I guess. You can see that come out.
I mean, because when you really think about it, it definitely seems like a weird angle. Like it's probably someone watching who's like, I don't understand how that makes any sense. But when you really think about it, Luke's journey is predicated on him not listening to Obi-Wan and Yoda, who say, you aren't ready, don't go. Like, you have to kill Vader. So in episode 5, it's interesting because he actually should have listened to them, right? He goes when he shouldn't, and he gets his hand chopped off when he's actually not ready.
Right.
But then in episode 6, they say he has to kill his father. He comes back because obviously the spoiler alert of like the century that everyone already knows is the whole "I am your father." And then when he tells Obi-Wan and Yoda, they're like, "Yeah, we knew. We just didn't want to tell you because like they didn't want him to freak out." And so they're like, "And you have to kill him." And so then what Luke decides to do ultimately in saving his father and making the correct choice that isn't easy is something outside of what those before him have said to do, what his authority has said to do. And so that's where I see sort of a Protestant undertone. But I'd also qualify that, like, right, if you find something, if you find the authority over you is ever saying anything that you know is not to be right, that's where conscience in the Catholic conception of it you should consider your conscience and you should hold to that. I mean, you have St. Thomas More, who is a Catholic in Anglican England, staying with that despite the fact that he knows that it'll have him killed. And the King of England says, you can avoid this if you just convert. Like, he was really close to the king. I think he had a high government status. I don't remember. But he said, no, I will stay true to what I do believe. And this makes me no less English. And so it's interesting because you have a sense of, like, he doesn't deny his English identity, but he still maintains his Catholic identity, even in the face of, like, his political authority telling him no. Right? So that's an idea that in some ways is very Protestant, but is also like acknowledged in the Catholic tradition too. It's like, I definitely, because when I think of things in that terms, it's sort of like about obeying authority. I don't want to make it seem like you have to 100% do like some authority tells you to do in every circumstance. I mean, you definitely, there's like an importance to that. You have to respect your authority. That's like an important part of just like of Christianity, right? Honor thy father and mother, and also like, render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's. Jesus emphasizes that like it's okay to live sort of in the political frame of like your society, but just remember what's most important. I feel like there's an interesting, not morally gray, but an interesting complexity there. And I think that's where I get annoyed when like the average person, I know there's some people who won't say this, but I feel like the average person will sometimes say like, ooh, I love that this story is like morally gray. And like, reality really is just like more morally gray. It's more real. But like, I push back against that because I think in some cases, the moral gray it's a little hard to decide whether something's right or not. But I push back against the idea that it's like more real in a sense than a black and white story, because all morally gray means is that it's a little difficult to discern if it's right or not. But it doesn't mean necessarily, at least the way I'm looking at it, that there isn't a right or wrong. It just means it's tough. And that's something we've always known. I think there's even examples in the Bible that like it's difficult to discern like what you need to do. I mean, there's lots of examples I think about it. Whenever anyone prays, it's like, is this really the right choice? Is this really what I should be doing?
Sure.
You aren't always sure. And so while I love stories that are, quote unquote morally gray and that really explore that sometimes it's hard to know what you should do, I don't like when people take that to mean, oh, then maybe it's just not real, or like it's not, there's no way to know. And I fundamentally disagree.
That's where originally when I was bringing up the Tower of Babel comes in,
Yeah.
and what society is wrestling with right now is so bringing in the narrative of liberalism, and I think liberalism did a lot of great things for political institution.
I
am in favor of the First Amendment and the freedom to practice your faith, and I know you are as well. In its
freedom.
terms.
I would say freedom to believe. I wouldn't say in every case freedom to practice, because I do think because of cults and because of the fact that there's obvious like.
Here's where I disagree with you in the sense that. If you're gonna let government determine like what isn't a cult and what isn't a religion, then the government has the power to put away Islam, put away Christianity, put away Judaism. They can put away anything. It becomes vague, and that's
what's difficult about
it becomes
politics,
more vague. You think you're trying to clear up the vagueness, but now it becomes more vague because they have the power to define what they want to be.
And I think so that's actually really topical, because a lot of news now is about how much power like Trump exerts over like various areas of like American society. And the question is like, is this right? Is this just? Is he like overreaching what he's done before? But the way I see it is like it's not in a vacuum at all. Like it's got to be because of like the historical approach I use, but I think about the fact that it's one president in a line of presidents who have slowly accumulated power, and I think I agree with you again on the maybe not closing up on the First Amendment, because anytime you give the government a power, it never goes away.
Yeah,
it never goes
rarely
away
does.
unless there's a huge effort and like a giant revolt. Nothing ever changes. Like the Magna Carta, like for the citizens to get their first rights, I think it was like a revolt, and like a bunch of people like had the king sit down and like write a document. And I think the sad thing about America is that you have like the executive branch has just like slowly accumulated like power over the centuries, like more and more and more and more.
Well, in a political sense, I think, dude, what is going on?
Oh, that's just because the card's
the
full.
card is full this time.
Yeah.
What?
The card finally filled.
Wow, look at that. I guess we'll keep talking just to kind of clear that up.
Yeah.
Let's see, what were we talking about? Politically, what were we on?
Yeah. So politically, I agree. I think I remember why when I was coming up with the idea of like maybe they should restrict religion a little bit. I think I came up with like the specific reason why. Not only it makes me uncomfortable low key when I'm saying like that I agree with it, because in the moment I think
that's what I was.
It kind of makes sense, right? But it's uncomfortable because should they have that power? That's the ultimate question. Because if they were good, right? If a human government was just good, then they could do a lot of things. And this is the religious framework.
That's the idea. That kind of calls into like the idea of maybe Plato's. Like Plato was never for democracy. He was for what was it called? Like
a monarchy.
Philosopher kings. That's what it was. Philosopher kings.
Yeah, I like Plato a lot because I think Plato has a lot to say on government that people don't think about. And part of it is, are we going to go over there?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Part of it is to do with the fact that, like, if you take a monarchy, for example, Americans hate monarchies stereotypically because we broke away from England, like, on that, like, literally on that issue, and, like, hating the king and not having a monarchy. But the thing about it is, and this is something deep about the human condition, if you have a good king, everything will be fine. Like happy ever after, it'll all be okay. But if you have a bad king, you have literally the worst kind of government ever. Like it's one or the other. But with democracy, the reason we have a democracy is the power is so diluted that it is very difficult to make either of those drastic switches. Things can't be as phenomenally amazing as if you have a great king, a philosopher king, but they also can't be phenomenally horrible.
Yeah.
Phenomenally horrible. Yeah.
The whole idea with democratic republic is the idea that human condition isn't perfect.
Yeah.
We can't have the philosopher kings as much as we want.
As much as we would.
What
if the next guy isn't one? That's the whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Politically, with regards to, you were saying like the executive branch is getting power, I think actually a lot of the power is being given to the bureaucracy, you know, and ultimately it's kind of, America's trending in a fashion where a lot of power is given to the bureaucracy. We don't even vote on this bureaucracy. It was kind of put in by one president.
Oh yeah, like the federal agencies.
Federal agencies, all of those.
That's a big problem. Yeah, because whenever, I mean, that goes back to what I was saying earlier, like whenever the government is given a power or gives itself a power, in the case of federal agencies, it never loses it because it's generally just how, I don't know, that's just how power works. And in society, you see over the centuries of, you know, whichever civilization, eventually things go bad. You know, you see in the Bible too, it's like people turn away from God, society goes down, and then God gives them a new chance, and then a new society builds. And I feel like, religiously speaking, I'm looking at a society where people are moving like markedly away from God in a way that's like a paradigm shift from where we were before. Like at least there was a good respect, I feel like, in the 20th century, and especially right out of World War II, there was a lot of like legitimate faith. But now we're at a point where like, I don't even know, we might hit like end time.
That was the point that I was trying to make with the Tower of Babel. So let me finish the point.
Yeah.
This is the third time's the charm. So the point was, Okay, yes, liberalism did come out of the Protestant Reformation. We have America today and its ideals of individualism and liberalism and so on. But the problem when you take individualism to its extreme, or this liberalism to its extreme, where we start to deny the virtues, the values, the stories, and the lessons and the truths that we've learned that resonates so much with Christianity, is that now with the individual is, okay, this is a problem that society is kind of wrestling with right now, is we want to define our own truth. We want to become our own gods. We say, God, we don't need you. This is a problem with... this is a problem just like in the direction of like society right now is like, we don't need God. We can figure everything out ourselves. This is where AI comes in a little bit too, because we don't need God, because actually we're going to create our own God, and this God's going to serve us.
Again, like a new golden calf kind of.
Yes.
Interesting.
But that's a little bit of the Tower of Babel. But here's how the Tower of Babel comes in, and the messing of the languages. It's where if everyone has their own relative truth, right, then there is no truth that we can agree on, right?
Yeah.
And you look in the story of the Tower of Babel is, okay, they're going to build up a tower and to reach the gods, to get the power of the gods for themselves. But God scrambles them and says, like, what are you doing? And now they can't speak the same language. But that's what's happening right now in our society, because in society right now, we're trying to define our own truth.
Yeah.
We're trying to define our own truth. We're trying to say, very obvious truths that humanity, has already known for hundreds of thousands of years. Very obvious truths of like biological truths, right? We're wrestling with this idea. Okay, is gender just more than a man and a woman, a male, female, right? We're struggling with these very fundamental truths.
Yeah.
And if we're all defining it in our own personal perspectives and we can't agree with each other, then effectively we lost language. And we've lost our ability to reason. We've lost our ability to be before the central idea of truth that grounds us. It's supposed to ground us. And that's where science kind of comes in too. Because science requires a religious mind to go into it. Because if there is no objective truth, you can't have science.
Yeah.
Science is built on this idea that there has to be this objective truth and this moral, not necessarily moral, but just sort of this truth, this floor that we all have to exist
a foundation.
on. A foundation.
Axiomatic position, basically.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's where God comes in. This idea that
transcendent truth. I think
transcended truth. Yeah. If we define our own truth, we can't even have a conversation with each other. That's what happens. That's where the language gets lost. Very specifically, there's a popular question proposed in society: what is a woman? Right?
There's memes as well.
For much of history, it might have been very easy to define what a woman is.
Yeah.
But now that we've tried to become our own gods, in this pursuit of becoming our own gods, we've lost objective truth. Everything's all subjective. And now we can't define simple scientific realities.
Yeah, and I think that's what you call the culture war, right? It sounds almost unassuming. It's just like, America's made up of a lot of cultures. So culture war just sounds like, two groups of people just kind of disagree. But it's really more fundamental than that would suggest. Because when you really think about a culture, just the straight up definition of a culture, it's not just like the practices and differences between what a group likes to do. It's also like fundamental values. There's a fundamental clash in society, which you're talking about, of the very basic idea of what is most important. I mean, going back to liberalism really quick, the big difference is also that when you put man as the center of society, you replace God. And so that kind of ties into what you were saying, where we've made gods of ourselves. That's literally what liberalism does from a religious point of view. That's what that is. And then with AI is a little horrifying because, it almost is like idolatry, because people become to depend on that too much. They come to identify with it as if it is a person or a living thing, even though it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't even have sentience yet, right?
I want to make one thing clear. With regards to liberalism, I consider myself a libertarian. I consider myself historically a rather liberal person. And I think politically, liberalism sets the stage for themes that are very necessary for society. This idea of exchange of dialogue, freedom to express, because we need this marketplace of ideas to be able to challenge different themes. And it's okay to have your own opinion. But it has to operate in a realm of this, this idea that we can be behind this objective, this belief that there is a truth out there, and that everyone can pursue that truth, and that truth is real, and it's studyable. You know, at least it's approachable. That's sort of the question we're wrestling with here. But I think liberalism as politics sets a great stage for that, and I think that's the beauty of what the American system is.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. I think what makes society now like kind of a tragic example of liberalism gone wrong is that we're double screwed in the sense that people don't trust scientific truth, right? There's like anti-vax, like all kinds of climate skepticism as well. And then on the other side, people don't agree on religious truth, which is that fundamental like ought sort of questions, right? What should we do? We shouldn't all agree on the exact same religion. But if we can't hold to very basic truths about like you said, like axiomatic things, the very foundation, then you can't have conversations about like policy, right?
I think one thing
you'll fundamentally want something different from it to begin with.
I think one thing to clear up there too is I think liberalism in my critiques with liberalism stops. My critiques with liberalism isn't liberalism. It actually starts with progressivism, I guess, and that's where the Tower of Babel comes in. Is I think liberalism actually set a very healthy stage for where America is, but I think liberalism without the storytelling, these very or without the callback to these important stories that we've been passing on, you and I would argue Judeo-Christianity being a very important story to tell on. I think that's where progressivism comes in. And I think progressivism is what's introducing some of the I would actually argue that's not progressing forward, but it's actually regressing. That we're kind of going back to some of the older times where everything was pluralistic and there was no ability to. It goes before the time of science.
To like Rome or
things were more pluralistic. We didn't have objective truth to be able to study things. I think we're kind of going back to that time.
Yeah. I think that's well said. I think also like neoliberalism is also another word for like sort of what you're getting at, because like classical liberalism is that basic idea of like reorienting society to kind of acclimate to the fact that people are fallen and that we need a system that like takes that into account. And I think that is maybe you could even say one of the faults of like the Catholic system of feudal Europe was that it was maybe collectivist to a fault. You know, maybe there was more need to like take the input of people, and because it was too late. I do remember hearing that like the Pope could have addressed a lot of the issues that Luther first started with, which were like practical issues. Those things could have been resolved earlier. But for whatever reason, the Pope was slow to act on that. So it's because of that later, Martin Luther ended up nailing his theses. We accepted the practical ones, and then when he got those, he ended up going, oh, well, how about these other ones, which were like completely...
a little bit more.
Which were different. But deep topic. But that's, I mean, it's interesting that liberalism, even though it's sort of outside the religious framework, it definitely shows that like you cannot have a purely theocratic society. Like I think some people, and I've seen this a lot online, a lot of people will be like, man, if we just had like Catholic king, if we just had like the Pope ruling over like the world or something. But I'm like, no, you can't do that because the Pope's still a dude. He's still a guy. And as much as that sounds like a cool fantasy, it's like, you got to remember that's why we got here in the first place.
Right.
Is because people are fallible. And we need to take that into account.
And that's written into the stories.
Yeah,
That you and
yeah.
I are trying to say we need to keep listening to the stories.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
it's fundamental that liberalism as a political sort of thing is good, and alongside with that, though, as humans who are flawed, as humans who sin, as humans who are broken, we need these stories. We need to keep listening to these stories, these narratives that go back to our roots, that go back to Judeo-Christian fundamentals, and and those stories help keep us in check as who we are as people. You know, we aren't perfect. We live in a society that won't ever be perfect, but the best that we can do on an individual level is to listen and to call back to those stories, the story of Christ, to emulate that story, and to live it out through example. And that story ultimately becomes another story for another person that will resonate with them.
Yeah, yeah. Well said.
Do you want to end it there?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I guess I would just say, I liked your thoughts on liberalism. At first, I was coming at it from the angle of, and I've wrestled with this question a lot, of would things be better if things were a little bit closer to the like sort of medieval concept of like Catholicism, which was like kind of an advisor to like the kingdoms, but also kind of had its own influence. And I definitely arrived at the conclusion that like no religion should have like outright political power. Like I hear about the papal states, I'm like, why was that a thing? I really like, I feel like that was like a piece of like the road to like the breaking up of Catholicism in Europe. And that's where, like you said, like we need to listen to the stories, because that is not new. I mean, you have the entire Hebrew Bible builds up to the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, and that stays together for less than a century. And the Bible is literally like thousands of years long. So in terms of like everything that happens in the Bible, it's like the teensiest slivet of it. And that just goes to show how difficult it is when you even have God on your side to stay with your morals and truth, and just to stay with God. It's really hard for humans to be good, and I think that's a great example of it. We see that in the world today, and yeah, like you said, listen to the stories, remember what happened before, because history repeats itself, and we'll all end up in the same cycle over and over again until Judgment Day. So let's not be that guy.
It's better to listen to the people who already went through it, learn their lessons, before we have to learn it ourselves. And ultimately, as humans, we get to learn them ourselves because we're flawed. But that's the beauty of life. That's what makes it fun.
For sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Santi, for coming and talking about storytelling. I hope you can come back and talk a little more about psychology and productivity as well.
Yeah.
I'd love to just talk about what is it, like daily productivity, just kind of things like that.
Yeah, maybe next time we could have a more chill conversation where we just talk about like obsidian the whole time.
Sure, yeah. Have you ever read like the book Atomic Habits?
Oh, I have.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I watched like a recap video recently because I wanted to like remember. And that's a phenomenal book. I would love to talk about that.
We could talk about simple self-help books like that, other things. But until next time, man, thank you for coming on the podcast. That was episode 2 with your host, Lorenzo. Thank you, Santi, for coming.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.